the balance between naturalism, what is real, and what is more imaginative is something that is played with even with the Virgin Mary. To the point that, like St. Luke in Roger van der Weyden's painting, this Virgin is modeled off of Agnes Sorel, mistress of the King of France. So Fouquet's Melun diptych shows on the left Etienne Chevalier and Saint Stephen, his patron saint. Etienne is French for Stephen. And on the right, we have now separated panels, a diptych, 2 panels of the Virgin in a rather interesting mode, right? Almost a composition of white spheres, head, breasts, even the Christ child, as ghostly pale white among these strangely shiny blue and red cherubs, right? Again, not a joke, not blasphemy, but a religious statement. This is a donor portrait on the left. This is Saint Stephen and Etienne offering their prayer, offering homage, honor to the Virgin. It's also a political statement because including Agnes Sorel, who was at this point deceased, said to have perhaps been poisoned and perhaps been carrying the king's child. This is Etienne's way of definitely choosing sides in palace intrigue. So he's on the side of the fallen mother of a very earthly Christ child, the king's son, a dauphin perhaps, the next in line for the king, for the crown. This is a perfect example perhaps of where the religious and the secular meet. So Etienne has a very spiritual stake in this, his place in heaven, and he has a very worldly stake in this, his place in the court, his influence, and his survival perhaps among what is going to be in the next few centuries one of the most murderous courts in Europe. Germany is no different, but we're going to end with Germany as kind of the leaders of the new mass media. Germany, remember, is right now in the 15th century a collection of multiple territories. There's no one kingdom of Germany. In these various towns, we have people like Gutenberg. We have printers with presses to create mass-produced writings and imagery. What they're not able to do is do so quite so efficiently. Often we say Gutenberg invented the printing press. That's not quite true. You could say he perfected it because of using movable type. That is cast iron blocks of letters that could be set in to spell out the text, say, of this book about Magdeburger, and quickly press out multiples of the same page and then bind the whole books together. So Gutenberg had his workshop just as Michael Wohlgemuth had his workshop. In this case, not putting together a Bible as Gutenberg does, but putting together essentially the Nuremberg Chronicle. Many of these chronicles, maybe you can hear it in the name, are histories of particular places like Nuremberg, or places, histories of entire kingdoms like France and England. So there's a lot of work that goes into collecting the information, arranging it on the printing press, and finally producing it and binding it. On top of that, when you add illustration, Wohlgemuth's workshop offers this very important craft of woodcut. So most of the page would be printed with black ink. Later on, we have the browns and greens and reds of the city scene hand-colored, added on later. So Vogelmut's working with simply black letter and line on white space paper. It's a very secular subject, so we don't have perhaps quite so many hidden symbols necessarily, but we do have a great sense of that imaginative versus that realistic, right? There are definitely very convincing elements. For example, the way that the buildings get smaller in the distance, the way that we have the road in the distance winding around the hills. We have the ripples in the water, and even a sense of reflection of the walls in the water. What is not so convincing, maybe not so naturalistic? The lines themselves, right? It reads more like a cartoon, heavy black outlines. We don't see a sense of necessarily fully three-dimensional buildings, except for angular and scale differences. Zooming in, we could see even more details. There's someone on the waiting docks, mills at work. So this is a bustling town. We get a lot of information from it, even though we can't read the Latin text above. Other texts like the Gutenberg Bible and Bibles printed after that would be printed more and more in languages like German, English, French, so that the townspeople could start to read for themselves. That's why I call this 15th century mass media, where people who could read, in this case Latin on the left, can access the history of the town. They can access almost like a tourist guide as well, places they've never been. And on the right-hand side with St. Anthony, they can access stories about the saints, models of human virtue and behavior and godliness that certainly the church would want them to emulate and aspire to. So again, these are both very public works because they're mass-produced in town workshops and sold, often in book form, but they're also very private. They are small-sized. You can take them with you. They're not attached to a giant altarpiece. They're not giant sculptures or paintings, and they're not just for rich people like the Duke of Berry. The difference between these two types: woodcut versus engraving. Woodcut is a relief print. That is, you start with a wood plank, and what you carve into the wood panel is going to eventually be like a wooden stamp that holds the black ink. The white space is what you're removing, so the ink sits on the highest remaining wood. Engraving is intaglio, which means to cut into. And that is incised, literally scratched into a metal plate like copper. What is white space on the paper is untouched copper. Get it? So what is untouched, uncarved in the wood becomes the black text. What is untouched, unincised, unengraved on the copper becomes white space on the paper. They're essentially very opposite ways of approaching an image on a matrix given wood or metal. On top of that, with engraving, the ink doesn't sit on top of the copper, it sinks down into the scratched lines. So Martin Schongauer can get even more detailed than Vogelmut and his workshop working with wood. So he has every little patch and crosshatch to get into the darkest, deepest values of the fur and the feathers of the demons here attacking poor St. Anthony. So Schongauer is able to do, with just black ink and incised line essentially the same thing that Van der Weyden and Van Eyck do with layers and layers of oil paint. He's describing these surface textures. He's convincing us that those little collection of lines there, those are feathers. Up here, fur. Over there, scales. And in the center, of course, Anthony's beard, his wrinkled skin on his forehead, and the torn and stretching fabric of his robes. All of this could be accompanied on the next page by text of St. Anthony's life, examples of why he was canonized, why he's important, why he is a saint. Also probably references to his importance as the patron saint of both diseases and cures. And that would be an ultimately important subject, remember, for a society that has survived the Black Death and subsequent waves of plague, for a society experiencing this renewed booming economy and a closeness and accessibility of artistic production that is quite unique in Germany at this time, at the very least, than what has happened before. The making of books used to happen in monasteries, handwritten, hand-painted by monks. Now we have beautiful books hand-painted by Limburg brothers. We have beautiful books printed on presses by Schongauer and Wohlgemuth and Gutenberg in languages like Latin, but also in the vernacular, accessible to everyone. So we can see engraving on the left, woodcut on the right, as I'm kind of zooming in here, at a microscopic level to the detail and scale of the engraving, where there's only so far you can zoom into the woodcut until you're just looking at paper and color, right? We have the sense of brick texture, we have the sense of wood, the sense of water, but nowhere near the representation of illusionistic textures as we get in the engraving on the left. So your takeaways for 15th century Northern Europe: think about the innovations, the oil paint, the engraving, the woodcut, and the printing press. Perspective at use. How does the court and wealthy merchant patronage shape the content? Think about the Engelbrechts and screen makers. Think about the French king and Agnes Sorel. They dictate, literally, what the painting will be about. The donor, the patron, can tell the artist what to paint. And how might we tell these regions apart? Can you look at something and say that's German, or that's Flemish, or Burgundian, or that's French? That's what you'll need to get to know as you study for the quiz.